Hello and welcome to the Will Work Integrated Learning Workshop with how to work with interpreters. This presentation is just to give you an overview of how interpreters work and the ethical codes that we need to follow, and also our preferred seating arrangements, and just really some general advice on working with LOTE speaking clients. So on to slide 2. Before we jump into our practice, just a definition of some of the terminology that we use in our industry. So translating and interpreting are out in the public used interchangeably. However, within our industry, they do have very distinct and specific meanings. So translating or translation refers to the transfer of meaning from a written document in one language to a written document in the other language. And somebody who does this work is known as a translator. Interpreting, however, refers to transferring of the spoken word from one language into the spoken word in another language. And an interpreter is a person who practices this skill. So the main function of an interpreter is to bridge the linguistic gap between you, a professional, and your client, or a client or a person who does not have English as a first language, or who is not fluent enough in English to navigate their daily life or navigate services that they need to access. Interpreters are not supposed to explain concepts or ideas. We are not supposed to advocate for either the LOTE speaker or the professional. We are not supposed to advise parties or give opinions. And we are also not supposed to provide extensive cultural consultation. Interpreters do have a preferred seating arrangement to allow facilitation of communication. So seating arrangements are quite important for successful communication between parties. In general, we prefer a triadic setting or a triangular setting. So that's where the client and the professional directly face each other, and the interpreter sits off to the side, as you can see here with the diagram. For Auslan interpreting, which is interpreting for deaf people using sign language or people who are hearing impaired, it is vital that the client, so the person using sign or the hearing impaired person, has a clear sight line with the interpreter. On to slide 5. There are some general tips that we like to provide to professionals when communicating via an interpreter or when using the services of an interpreter. So before an engagement, it's really important that you understand clearly the language, the dialect, or the ethnicity of your LOTE speaking client. Sometimes agencies or professionals or English-speaking clients book interpreters in the wrong language because they may have misunderstood or they haven't properly diagnosed the language needs of the LOTE speaker, and then an interpreter might turn up to an assignment but would have to withdraw because they're not certified in that particular language or that particular dialect. So an example of this might be a Sudanese Arabic speaker or an Egyptian Arabic speaker needing a Sudanese Arabic interpreter or an Egyptian Arabic interpreter. It's also really important if you can give an interpreter a briefing. So a briefing is sharing any background information about the client, maybe from previous consultations, what you want to achieve in the encounter, so your expected outcomes, and information that you believe is vital for the interpreter to know for your consultation to be successful. During an engagement, it's really important that you speak directly to the client, both in terms of the language you use and your maintaining of eye contact and the positioning of your body. So examples of this would be saying, "How are you today, Mrs. X?" straight to the loudspeaker, rather than facing the interpreter and saying, "Could you ask Mrs. X how they are today?" It's really important that you as the professional maintain eye contact with a loud-speaking client, even with the interpreter present, so that you can observe your client's non-verbal responses. Where possible, it's preferable if you avoid technical language, jargon, and acronyms that may be unfamiliar to the interpreter, especially if they haven't had experience in your industry, or that may be difficult for an interpreter to explain or paraphrase into another language because maybe those terms just don't exist, or from a cultural perspective, they may require a lot of explanation, which can take up a lot more time and can make the consultation or the dialogue quite disjointed. If you can remember, it would be really helpful for you to pause after every couple of sentences to allow interpreting. Most interpreters in spoken language work in consecutive mode. So this means that they wait for one speaker to deliver an utterance or to deliver a couple of sentences. Then they'll either pause the speaker or wait for a natural break in the speech to then relay the information into the opposite language. It's also great if you can check understanding with the client, as this responsibility lies with the professional and not with the interpreter. Ethically, interpreters are not supposed to explain or check for understanding. So when it comes from the professional, it's really good at gauging how much a loudspeaker has understood. So basically, this means asking a loud-speaking client to repeat back to you what you said or explain something to you using their own words, which the interpreter can then convey. After an engagement, where possible, it's really great for a professional and an interpreter to have a debriefing. So a really quick discussion on what worked during the consultation and maybe what didn't work, so that both you and the interpreter can improve your performance for the next time. Also, in particularly difficult consultations, if you can just check on an interpreter's emotional well-being, it can be really helpful for the interpreter, as more often than not, interpreters don't have access to counselling or psychological assistance. So when it comes from professionals, it can just help interpreters to vent and decompress. And again, it's very beneficial for their future experiences in similar industries. As I previously mentioned, interpreters do have a code of ethics that we're expected to abide by. So some of the principles of the code that can also affect professionals include confidentiality, impartiality, accuracy, professional conduct and role boundaries, and ongoing professional development. So in terms of confidentiality, interpreters must keep what they hear and what they relay secret, and they're not supposed to discuss their assignments outside of the professionals and the clients who have worked within those particular situations. So interpreters do not disclose the private personal information of either client, and they do not discuss what happens within the consultations that they work in unless bound by law. Interpreters are also expected to remain impartial. So as mentioned in the previous slides, we do not advocate for any particular party, we do not give advice, and we do not give our opinions. We treat both the professional or the English speaker and the Lot speaking client as the same. Interpreters are also expected to be as accurate as possible in their meaning transfer. So this often means that an interpreter may ask you to repeat a phrase or a concept or further explain it, not because they haven't understood it or because they're forgetful, but more often than not because they need to further clarify that phrase or sentence in the opposite language in order to be 100% accurate. Interpreters must also display professional conduct in all the work that they do. So they are expected to dress appropriately, to be on time for assignments, to be polite, understanding, and culturally sensitive to all parties. And we do work within a strict role boundary. So, as mentioned earlier on, interpreters cannot explain for clients when it is beyond their role as an interpreter. So, when clients have specific questions about certain ideas or concepts, an interpreter must relay that back to the professional, and the professional would then explain further, which would be interpreted. So we are not allowed to explain things of our own accord, even if the interpreter knows definitions or knows what things mean. Interpreters are also supposed to undergo ongoing professional development. So we do attend professional development sessions, we do access further education, and these sessions often focus on certain industries within Australia, skills that interpreters need to improve on, and also anything that can help us to improve our technique or our vocabulary in both Lot and English. So if there are no further questions, we can now begin our workshop. Thank you very much.